George C. Scott leaned across the Tonight Show desk, his voice already carrying the specific rough edge that decades of colleagues had learned to recognize as dangerous, and said something to Clint Eastwood that made 23 million Americans lean forward in their living rooms. It was October 8, 1978, 11:52 p.m. NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man who had once refused an Academy Award on principle was now live on national television, calling one of the biggest movie stars in the world a fraud. Coming up, exactly what George C. Scott said that night, the real reason his own career had left him angrier than almost anyone in Hollywood understood, and the 7 words Clint Eastwood said back to him that left Scott completely unable to respond. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double check if you've subscribed. And thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that George C. Scott's anger was never really about Clint Eastwood at all. George C. Scott was born in Wise, Virginia in 1927, and by the time he walked onto that Tonight Show stage in 1978, he had built one of the most respected and most tumultuous careers in American acting, a reputation built on ferocious, uncompromising performances that had earned him widespread critical acclaim, alongside a personal life marked by well-documented struggles with alcohol, and a temper that colleagues across 4 decades of film and stage work learned to approach with genuine caution. He had served in the United States Marine Corps in the years immediately following World War II, an experience that friends said left him with a specific and lasting relationship to masculine performance, a conviction that real toughness had almost nothing to do with the kind of stoic, controlled screen presence that increasingly defined popular American cinema, and everything to do with confronting difficult truths directly, loudly, and without flinching. This conviction reached its most famous public expression in 1971, when Scott, having won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in Patton, refused the award entirely, calling the ceremony itself a meaningless popularity contest that had nothing to do with genuine artistic achievement, a gesture that cemented his public reputation as Hollywood's most uncompromising and most difficult truth-teller. What almost nobody outside Scott's closest circle of friends understood in the years following that famous refusal was the considerable private cost of maintaining that specific reputation. The exhausting work of constantly proving, to himself as much as to anyone else, that he had not simply become another actor performing a persona for public consumption. The specific origin of Scott's particular relationship to confrontation deserves fuller understanding, because it explains a great deal about what drove him toward Eastwood that October evening. Scott's own father had been a distant and demanding figure, a man who valued unambiguous displays of strength, and who had, according to accounts given by Scott's own family members, communicated disapproval far more readily than approval throughout Scott's childhood. Scott carried this dynamic into his own adult relationships and into his approach to his craft, developing a conviction, reinforced across decades of theatrical training and performance, that genuine artistic honesty required a kind of total, unguarded exposure, a willingness to let an audience see every unattractive and difficult truth about a character, rather than filtering that truth through anything resembling technical restraint. This conviction produced genuinely extraordinary performances across his career, but it also produced, according to people who knew him well, a specific and persistent suspicion of performers whose success seemed to depend on withholding rather than revealing, a suspicion that had, by 1978, hardened into something close to genuine contempt for an entire category of screen performance that Scott believed was fundamentally dishonest regardless of its commercial success. His drinking, which had been a genuine private struggle since his years in the Marines, intensified during this period. And colleagues who worked with him during the middle 1970s described a man who seemed, increasingly, to be searching for confrontations that might prove, definitively, that he remained the genuine article in an industry he had grown to believe was populated primarily by careful, calculated performers, protecting comfortable public images, rather than risking anything real. Clint Eastwood, by 1978, represented, in Scott's private estimation according to friends who discussed this with him directly, precisely the kind of performer Scott had grown to distrust. A man whose entire screen persona was built on a specific and deliberate minimalism. The quiet, controlled, almost expressionless authority that had made Eastwood one of the biggest stars in the world through characters who said as little as possible and let a narrowed gaze do the emotional work that Scott believed real acting required considerably more from a performer to achieve honestly. What Scott did not know, and what almost nobody in Hollywood fully understood about Clint Eastwood in 1978, was the specific and genuinely dangerous experience that had shaped Eastwood's understanding of controlled composure long before he ever appeared in a film, an experience Eastwood had discussed publicly only in the barest possible outline, never with the full detail that explained exactly why his screen persona of quiet, unshakable calm was not, in fact, the absence of genuine feeling that critics like Scott assumed it represented. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals something about Clint Eastwood that changed how an entire industry understood him. Clint Eastwood was drafted into the United States Army in 1951 during the Korean War and served primarily as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord in California, a posting that spared him from combat deployment, but that placed him, in the autumn of that year, aboard a Douglas AD bomber attempting to return to base after a routine training flight along the Northern California coast. The aircraft, running low on fuel and caught in worsening weather, was forced to ditch in the Pacific Ocean off Point Reyes, a specific and genuinely life-threatening emergency that Eastwood rarely discussed in any detail across his entire subsequent public career. The plane went down roughly 2 miles offshore in cold water and difficult surf conditions, and Eastwood, along with the pilot, was forced to swim the entire distance back to shore in darkness, a swim that took nearly 3 hours, and that both men, by any reasonable assessment of the conditions, were fortunate to survive at all. Eastwood arrived on the beach exhausted, hypothermic, and, according to the account he eventually gave in one of his only detailed discussions of the incident, profoundly and permanently changed by the specific experience of believing, for 3 hours in cold, dark water, that he was very likely going to die. This experience, according to people close to him who understood its full weight, became the actual private foundation of the controlled, minimalist screen presence that would eventually make him one of the most successful actors in the world, though almost nobody watching his films ever connected the two. The specific details of that night deserve fuller documentation, because the ordinary retelling of the incident, when Eastwood discussed it at all, tended to compress 3 hours of genuine mortal danger into a brief and understated anecdote that obscured exactly how close both men came to not surviving. The Pacific waters off Point Reyes in late autumn run cold enough to produce hypothermia within a relatively short period of sustained exposure, and both Eastwood and the pilot, whose name has been recorded in some later accounts as Lieutenant F.C. Anderson, understood, from the moment the aircraft struck the water, that their survival depended entirely on reaching shore before the cold overwhelmed their bodies' remaining capacity to keep swimming. They lost sight of each other repeatedly in the darkness and the swells, each man uncertain for long stretches whether the other had survived the initial impact. And Eastwood later described, in the rare moments he discussed the experience at all, the specific and disorienting quality of swimming through complete darkness with no reliable way to judge distance or progress, simply continuing to move his arms and legs because stopping meant certain death, trusting a general sense of direction toward shore that he could not actually verify until the shape of the coastline finally became visible against the night sky. This specific memory of forcing his body to continue functioning through exhaustion and cold and genuine uncertainty about whether the effort would ultimately succeed became, according to those who understood him best, the exact template for the controlled screen presence that critics like Scott would later mistake for an absence of genuine internal experience. Eastwood had learned, during those 3 hours in the Pacific, something about panic that he carried for the remainder of his life. That panic, however completely justified by genuine mortal danger, accomplished nothing except making an already desperate situation more dangerous. That the only path back to shore ran through a specific and total discipline of remaining calm, regardless of what his body and mind were actually experiencing internally. This was not, as critics like George C. Scott assumed, the absence of feeling. It was the product of having felt once, more completely and more terrifyingly than almost anyone watching his films could imagine, and having learned, through direct and nearly fatal experience, that survival depended entirely on the ability to set that feeling aside and function anyway. Eastwood rarely explained this publicly, partly out of genuine reticence about a night he considered deeply private, and partly, according to friends, because he understood that explaining it would undermine the specific and effective screen persona he had built, a persona that depended on audiences experiencing his calm as mysterious and innate, rather than as something forged, at considerable personal cost, in a specific night of genuine terror. Johnny Carson had booked both men for that evening's broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons, each promoting a current project, a pairing Carson's producers considered simply good television, given both men's enormous individual popularity, though nobody on the production staff fully anticipated the specific tension that would emerge once the two men were seated together. Carson himself had interviewed both men separately on numerous previous occasions and had developed, over those years, a specific understanding of each man's professional temperament that made him privately curious, according to a comment he made to a producer before the broadcast, about how the pairing might unfold. He had found Scott, in previous appearances, brilliant but genuinely unpredictable, capable of extraordinary candor, but also of the kind of volatility that occasionally made live broadcasts genuinely tense rather than simply entertaining. Eastwood, by contrast, had always been a reliably composed guest, generous with his time, but rarely offering the kind of unguarded personal disclosure that made for the most memorable television moments. Carson mentioned to this producer that he suspected the pairing might produce either a genuinely fascinating conversation about the different paths to authentic performance, or something considerably more volatile, and that he intended to let the conversation develop naturally, rather than steering it too aggressively in either direction. A decision that would prove, within the hour, to have been exactly the right call. George C. Scott arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon, having, according to a production assistant present that day, already consumed a considerable amount of alcohol before the taping, a detail the staff noted with private concern but did not feel authorized to address directly, given Scott's stature and reputation. Clint Eastwood arrived separately, composed and professionally reserved as always, greeting the production staff with his characteristic quiet courtesy before retreating to his dressing room to prepare. The broadcast began normally, both men discussing their respective projects with Carson's usual skillful guidance, though several people present later noted that Scott's answers carried a specific edge and unpredictability that seemed, in retrospect, to be building towards something. Roughly 17 minutes into the segment, Carson, attempting to generate an interesting exchange between two performers whose screen personas differed so completely, asked both men what they believed genuine acting actually required. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. George C. Scott answered first, and his answer, according to everyone present, began reasonably enough, a genuine and considered reflection on emotional honesty and vulnerability as the foundation of meaningful performance. He spoke about his own theatrical training, about the specific discipline of allowing an audience complete access to a character's most difficult and unflattering internal states, describing this total exposure as the only form of acting he considered genuinely respectable. But as he continued speaking, his voice began carrying an increasing intensity, the specific rising heat that colleagues who had worked with him for years recognized as the early stage of a genuine outburst rather than simply passionate conversation. And he turned, without warning, directly toward Eastwood and said that some actors had built entire careers hiding behind a squint and a whisper, letting audiences project meaning onto an absence of actual emotional content, essentially accusing Eastwood, in front of the entire viewing audience, of having built his stardom on a kind of elaborate fraud, technical minimalism mistaken by an undiscerning public for genuine depth. The studio audience, sensing the specific danger in Scott's tone, went completely silent, several people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing a genuine confrontation or an unusually pointed professional disagreement that might still resolve itself gracefully. Clint Eastwood did not respond immediately. He looked at Scott for a long moment, his expression carrying none of the defensive heat that Scott's accusation might reasonably have provoked, simply a quiet and unhurried attention that several people present found, in its own way, more unsettling than an angry response would have been. This specific quality of stillness, according to the show's director who reviewed the footage afterward, was precisely what made the moment so genuinely tense rather than simply awkward, because it gave no indication of which direction Eastwood's eventual response would take. Several members of the production staff, watching from the control room, described a genuine uncertainty in those several seconds of silence about whether they were about to witness Eastwood absorb the insult with professional grace, respond with some version of his own considerable temper, or simply allow the moment to pass without meaningful response at all. Johnny Carson, sensing the genuine danger in the moment, began to redirect, but Eastwood, with a small and deliberate gesture, indicated that he wanted to answer. He said, quietly enough that the studio had to lean in to hear him clearly, that George was welcome to believe whatever he wanted about the craft of acting, and that he had genuine respect for Scott's talent and for the honesty of his performances. But then he said something that changed the entire temperature of the room. He said that he had learned, a long time ago, in circumstances he rarely discussed, that the loudest reaction to fear was not always the most honest one, and that sometimes the truest thing a person could do in the middle of genuine terror was simply keep moving forward without letting anyone else see exactly how frightened they actually were. He said this without elaborating on the specific experience he was referencing, but something in the quality of his voice, a weight that had not been present in his earlier, more casual answers, made clear that he was not speaking in the abstract. George C. Scott, who had built an entire public identity around the conviction that visible, unguarded emotional intensity was the only honest response to genuine feeling, found himself, for one of the only times in his public career, without an immediate response. He looked at Eastwood for a long moment, and several people present described his expression shifting from its earlier combative edge into something more genuinely uncertain. The specific uncertainty of a man confronting the possibility that his own conviction, held with such total confidence for so many years, might not be the only legitimate way to carry genuine feeling through a difficult moment. Johnny Carson, reading the shift in the room with the sensitivity that had defined his decades of hosting, asked Eastwood, gently, whether he wanted to say more about what he meant. Eastwood was quiet for a moment, and then, for the first time in any public setting, he described, briefly and without excessive detail, the night in 1951 when a plane he was aboard went down in the Pacific, and he and the pilot were forced to swim for hours through cold, dark water, uncertain whether they would reach shore alive. He said that he had learned, in those hours, that panic served no purpose except making an already dangerous situation worse, and that the specific discipline of staying calm, of simply continuing to move forward without giving in to the entirely justified terror of the moment, had saved his life that night, and had shaped, in ways he rarely discussed, nearly everything about how he approached both his work and his private existence in the decades since. The studio audience, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they had experienced at a live television taping. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific quality of that silence as fundamentally different from ordinary television tension. Less the anxious quiet of an audience uncertain whether a confrontation would escalate, and more the reverent stillness of people witnessing two performers set aside their public personas entirely and simply speak honestly to each other for the first time. George C. Scott, according to multiple accounts, was visibly affected, his earlier combative energy having given way to something considerably more reflective. He said, quietly, that he owed Eastwood an apology, that he had spent years assuming that quiet composure represented an absence of genuine feeling, when in fact, as Eastwood had just demonstrated, it could represent something considerably more difficult to achieve, feeling fully and completely, and choosing, deliberately, not to let it overwhelm the capacity to keep functioning. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely reflective conversation than either man had likely anticipated when the broadcast began, both performers discussing, with unusual candor, the specific and different ways their respective approaches to performance had been shaped by genuine personal experience rather than simply competing theories of craft. Scott, in particular, spoke at length about his own service in the Marine Corps and the specific expectations of visible toughness that environment had instilled in him. Expectations he said he had never fully examined until that exact moment, sitting across from a man who had survived something genuinely life-threatening and had emerged from it with an entirely different conclusion about what strength actually required. He said that he had spent years believing that his own volatility, his willingness to let audiences and colleagues see his anger and his intensity without restraint, represented a kind of superior honesty compared to performers who kept their internal experience more carefully guarded. He said that watching Eastwood describe those 3 hours in the Pacific had made him consider, for what he admitted was possibly the first time in his adult life, that restraint itself could be its own form of honesty, a different but equally legitimate response to genuine fear rather than simply its suppression. Eastwood, in turn, said that he had genuine respect for Scott's willingness to expose difficult and unflattering truths in his performances, and that he understood, better than Scott perhaps realized, that this kind of exposure required its own considerable courage. The two men, by the end of this extended exchange, had arrived at something that resembled genuine mutual understanding. Not agreement exactly, but a recognition that their profoundly different approaches to performance and to processing difficulty both originated from real and specific experience, rather than either being, as each had privately suspected of the other, simply a technique adopted for professional advantage. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most unexpectedly substantive conversations about acting and authenticity the program had ever produced. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls in the days following the broadcast. Viewers writing and calling specifically to say that watching two performers with such different public personas find genuine common ground, live and unscripted, had moved them considerably more than either man's individual film work ever had. Several of these callers, according to the production staff member who logged responses that week, specifically mentioned veterans in their own families, men who had returned from military service carrying experiences they rarely discussed, and who had, according to these callers, responded to something in Eastwood's brief and understated account of the plane crash that felt immediately and painfully familiar. One caller, whose own father had served in Korea, said that her father had watched the broadcast with her and had, for the first time in her entire life, begun quietly describing an experience of his own that he had never previously mentioned to anyone in the family, a disclosure she directly credited to watching Eastwood demonstrate that quiet composure and genuine unspoken feeling were not, in fact, mutually exclusive. George C. Scott and Clint Eastwood never developed a close friendship in the years that followed. Their fundamentally different temperaments and working styles never fully reconciling into anything resembling genuine intimacy. But colleagues who worked with both men in later years said that Scott spoke of Eastwood, from that point forward, with a specific and genuine respect that had been entirely absent before that broadcast, and Eastwood, for his part, occasionally referenced Scott's talent in later interviews with a warmth that suggested the confrontation had left both men with something considerably more valuable than either had expected walking onto that stage. There is one final detail about that broadcast that deserves to be understood more fully, something that connects the entire arc of this confrontation back to what both men eventually took from it. In a later interview, given years after the broadcast, Clint Eastwood was asked directly why he had chosen that specific evening of all his public appearances across a long and heavily documented career to finally discuss the Point Reyes crash in any detail. He said that something in Scott's accusation, however unfair it felt in the moment, had touched a genuine and long-standing frustration he carried privately about being misunderstood by exactly the kind of serious, theatrically trained performers whose respect he had always secretly valued more than he let on publicly. He said that he had spent years being dismissed by critics and by some fellow actors as a limited performer trading on physical presence rather than genuine craft, and that Scott's specific accusation, delivered with such total confidence in front of millions of people, had finally pushed him toward a disclosure he might otherwise have continued withholding indefinitely. He said that he did not regret the decision, that something about finally explaining the actual foundation of his screen persona, even briefly and without excessive detail, had relieved a private frustration he had not fully realized he was still carrying. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the assumptions you carry about people whose way of processing difficulty looks different from your own. Whether that difference reads as